Oh my goodness. Okay, sound good? Okay, great. So, hello and welcome everybody to our May monthly program. I'm very excited to welcome back Maria Russo, who I'll introduce in a little bit after some announcements for this month's program. My name is Sonia Melander and I'm the Associate Director of Education with PFAS. And so before I introduce Maria, I'm going to give you some updates, just a few little tidbits from our world lately here at the Potomac Valley Audubon Society. So first of all, a huge heartfelt thank you to everybody who has reached out with kind words, kind thoughts, financial support following the big news last week, which was the cut to our AmeriCorps funding. It was a huge change for us. We've been rapidly adapting to those changes, way faster than we've been able to tell you all about, but working very closely with, of course, our AmeriCorps, but our partners at other AmeriCorps sites around the state of West Virginia, and you all, as you've been reaching out with kind words and again, financial support for helping us through this transition. So our AmeriCorps have still been leading work days, like Mason over there is leading work days, taking care of our wonderful nature spaces around us and teaching kids, right? So the day after we received the news about AmeriCorps funding, there they were at 8 a.m. or whatnot it was, to start the field trip with 100 kids, teaching them about watershed and taking care of our water and our space. So they've been at it today. We had 60 people that we were teaching about turtles at turtle time at the Case Nature Center. And yeah, it's been great to be able to keep that continuity for our community and of course for our members, just keeping the team together. So we've gotten that outpouring of generosity, and it's gotten us some of the way to the true cost of what it's going to be to keep on our AmeriCorps for the term that we've committed to them, which is what they were planning on into August. So keeping on with the field trips, the preserve maintenance during growing season and summer camp season as well. So of course, if you would like to make a donation, that is always, always welcome. And of course, there's many ways that you can support our organization and our work. And one of them is plants. It's planting season, and it's always great to have native plants. And we have our spring native plant sale. Pre-order has a few days left. It's May 7th today. So pre-order has just a few days left. If you don't manage to get a pre-order in time, you can still stop by the Sunny Meadows Garden Center on the day of sale, and we'll probably still have some good things then as well that you can use to support your pollinators and PFAS both. Another way you can support PFAS and also have just a really lovely time in a beautiful space is an upcoming fundraiser that we have. So this is a June 1st event. It's going to be some really nice, like elevated brunch, some delicious, wonderful things in this protected farmland area. Hank Willard is the host of this event, and we're very excited to be doing this. So it's a garden party with a view, and RSVP are due soon. I don't think I can actually see it down there, but it's May something. 25th, I think. May 25th, okay, is when we're asking for RSVPs for. So please keep that in mind and we hope we see you there. As you know, we have tons of different public programs that we do, and I'm not gonna rattle off all of them, but I do just want to point out this Saturday, which is World Migratory Birds Day. So that's a very, very exciting thing, and we have 2 bird walks in some beautiful places that are outside of our normal bird walk spaces. So they're both personal properties, so people who are generously opening up their personal spaces so we can see the birds there. So one is at the Walsh property, so that's in the Charlestown vicinity, and then one is at Red Fox Farm, and so that is over in Maryland, close to Cunningham State Falls Park. So very, very cool places. And just down the road here, NCTC, National Conservation Center, is opening up their space for bird count. So that's very exciting. It's always fun to go to NCTC. RSVP is required to do that, and information about that will be going out in our heads up newsletter tonight. So yeah, think about all these cool options you have for celebrating birds this weekend, and hope to see you at some of them. This is the last monthly program until we reconvene in the fall, but we already have our fall speaker lined up, and it's a pretty exciting one and kind of related to tonight. Well, not kind of, very related to tonight, but it's more the scientific background of the geology and hydrology of the Eastern Panhandle. So a geology professor from WVU, Dorothy Vesper, who specializes in karst, is going to be talking about that topic, the geology and hydrology of the Eastern Panhandle. So that should be really interesting and really cool, and put it on your calendar. Okay. And with that, I am always happy to welcome Maria Russo, who has been a speaker with us before. So last year, she graciously, along with Jenna Dodson, was a speaker for our monthly program to talk about PFAS. Today, she is going to be speaking on a related but different and more broad subject, as you know. But first, about Maria. So Maria was raised on a small farm in Shenandoah Junction and went on to attend Brown University, earning bachelor's degrees in both public policy and Latin American studies. Early in her career, Maria worked on restorative drug policy and criminal justice campaigns, supporting grassroots organizing efforts and public policy advancement. More recently, Maria worked as a lobbyist with the West Virginia Environmental Council, helping to pass the PFAS Protection Act and other legislation that supports environmental protection in the state of West Virginia. As the policy specialist at West Virginia Rivers, Maria hopes to combine policy progress with community engagement to ensure effective participation in shaping the future we hope to see. So join me in welcoming Maria.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I want to thank the Potomac Valley Audubon Society for the incredible work that they continue to do, all of the programming that they offer in our community, especially during these times where they're facing some shifts. They're continuing to just do some really awesome work and provide such important programming. So thank you all for having me back, and thank you for all that you do. So another round of applause for PVAS. As stated, my name is Maria Russo. I'm the policy specialist with West Virginia Rivers Coalition. So over the last 2 years, I've been working at West Virginia Rivers to advance our public policy platform. And we are a statewide organization that works to protect and promote our very bountiful water resources across the state of West Virginia. We're incredibly fortunate to have a large amount of water in West Virginia, and it's our job, we see it as our job to really protect it. And stand up for that water, especially under that gold dome in Charleston that you see in that picture. Also shout out to my colleague who just walked in, Dr. Than Hitt. He's here and will probably be able to weigh in on just as many pieces of this info as I can this evening. So during the 2025 legislative session, what we saw in a lot of our work is that we were really required to hold the line. We were defending existing protections, trying to prevent harmful rollbacks and stopping any new bills that came up, especially the very harmful ones, some of which I'll get into this evening. So I'm going to be talking about impacts and outcomes on environmental protection and water quality. And I'm going to be breaking this down into kind of 4 categories: water quality, public lands, community science, and data centers. And if any of you were at the talk last week, I'll be covering a lot of the same material, but it might sound a little different this week. So you might get a little twist on some things, or we can dig into a little more in the question and answer section. So really quick before I begin, I just want to give a quick legislative a 60-day legislative session. So what that means is that once legislative session starts, every day counts, even the weekends, even if there are no committee meetings on those weekend days, and it is a mad dash to the finish line. So we move very quickly. We introduce a lot of bills in our legislature. So we see ideas come up, and we see a lot of interesting ideas come up, many of which we prompt questions at. So I'm gonna be going through all of those across those different categories. But a lot of people in this room probably know this, but how does a bill become a law? As we know, it starts in either our West Virginia House of Delegates or our West Virginia State Senate. So it starts in either of the two chambers. Once it's introduced, it has to pass the committees that it's referenced to. Then it has to pass the floor of that chamber that it started in. It has to cross over, do the same process on the other side, committee and the house and the floor. And then once it passes both chambers, they agree on the bill passing in that form, and it goes to the governor's desk. So I just want to say that because as I talk through tonight, I might say, oh, this bill got stalled in committee, or this bill passed one chamber but not the other, and I wanted everybody to be on the same page as we go through that. So let's dive into it. I already kind of covered this. I'll be talking about those 4 different categories, and then we'll have a Q&A. If you have questions, even that fall outside of those categories, feel free to hold them until the end, and we'll have some time to cover those. So the first category being water quality. This is, of course, the most directly impactful to us at West Virginia Rivers Coalition. And one bill that we saw come up this year was House Bill 2233. And this was actually a DEP rules package, which happens every year. DEP passes their rules to say this is how we'll operate. Unfortunately, what we saw in this situation is a very harmful amendment slipped into that process. So the rules package was very standard. This amendment was very surprising. In our water quality standards, we have those in the state, and they go through a review process every 3 years. So we call it the triennial review of water quality standards. And in those standards, we have category A waters, which are drinking water. We have category B waters, which are trout waters, and we have category C, which are recreational. And all of these are protected at varying levels and have different standards to uphold. The category A is, of course, the most stringent because it's our drinking water protections. And this specific version of these protections has been in place since the 1960s. And essentially what West Virginia decided to do at that time is to protect all water as if it was a drinking water source that is either currently used as a drinking water source or could potentially be in the future. What we saw this year is that they removed a lot of protections, or they amended to, and we didn't know if it was gonna pass. They said, we're only gonna protect the drinking water sources that we're currently using. We're gonna remove the protections of all those future potential uses. And the way they framed it, we heard conversation on the House floor and people were saying, we're out here protecting puddles and we're protecting potholes. So we need to remove these standards because we don't need to be protecting puddles and potholes. What the truth is that we weren't protecting puddles and potholes. We were protecting small tributaries that eventually flow downstream into our drinking water sources. And so we saw a lot of breakdown there in the dialogue of what was actually being protected versus what was being discussed. We heard this referred to on the House floor as the corporate discharge amendment, because it really was. It was an opportunity for corporations to be allowed to put more toxic pollution into our water sources. And some of those could eventually flow into our drinking water sources. So we saw this category A amendment come up after the public comment period had already closed on water quality standards. So it really bypassed the public comment process. It bypassed us being allowed to weigh in on that. It moved very quickly, and we saw it really weaken our water quality standards in the state. So this is not great news that it passed. I gave it a big red pass on those slides because it passed and it's very unfortunate. But my colleague Fan likes to remind us that this fight is not over. because we saw massive public opposition on this. We saw a lot of people speak up and say, we don't want this. And we will have an opportunity to still speak up about this, because we're gonna continue to engage at the regulatory and the implementation levels. These corporations, if they do want to apply to, essentially roll back their discharge permits, they will have to go through an application process to do that. And we'll be watching very closely to make sure that those permit reforms happen in a way that does not harm our public health. So that is something that we will definitely be continuing to watch and keeping our eyes on as we move forward. The second bill that we saw in the water quality category was the above ground storage tank bill. This was Senate Bill 592. And how many people in this room remember the 2014 water crisis? Yeah, I'm seeing a lot of hands go up. So this was when the Freedom Industries had a chemical leak right near the Elk River, just upstream from, less than a mile upstream from the West Virginia American Water's Charleston intake. So what we saw is these chemicals leaked, and 300,000 West Virginians were without drinking water. They were without safe water to bathe in, to shower in for weeks. It was incredibly harmful. We saw, massive impact across over 10 counties. It was a really serious situation. That was over 10 years ago. So following that, we saw some landmark legislation pass at the legislature back in 2014, and it was actually unanimous. If you can believe that or not, everyone agreed these chemicals cannot leak into the water. We've got to do something about these tanks. Let's band together. Thankfully, it happened in January, so they were able to respond pretty immediately in the legislature, and by the end of session, we had a really comprehensive above ground storage tank act. Unfortunately, though, what we've seen in the last 10 years is chipping away at that above ground storage tank act. So while everybody agreed we had to do something about it in 2014, the story sort of starts to change by 2016, 2018, 2020. We start to hear that it's not as necessary. And we've seen different rollbacks. And so this year was especially surprising because we saw a proposal to roll back protections on nearly 1,000 oil, gas, and coal tanks that contain very harmful chemicals, some of them even containing MCHM, which is the same chemical that leaked in 2014. And so we saw essentially rollbacks to square one, and we really didn't want to see that. And so we fought this at every level. It did pass out of committee in the Senate. It passed the Senate floor, it went over to the House, it passed committee there. We were watching it roll on and we were getting very nervous about this. But just before the end of session, we ended up seeing this bill move to the inactive calendar, which is usually a really good sign because it means something has gone on. And thankfully we had DEP's support on this to say, we really need to make sure that these tank regulations stay in place. And we were able to defeat this bill in the last minute of session. I know I'm moving quickly through a lot of information, so I'll definitely give time at the end for Q&A to ask any questions. I'm gonna move through these next few a little bit more quickly. So for our public lands and public access bills, we saw a lot come up this year. The first one is around Senate Bill 627. This was the carbon transport bill. And the original bill would have allowed carbon sequestration in our state parks. And this is yet another example of a bill we've seen year after year. We saw a lot of multi-year attempts come back up this year, especially if they had been defeated in prior sessions successfully. They were really trying it this year. They thought maybe this was the year that they could get some through. This bill did pass, but we were able to amend it successfully. And so we were able to prohibit these activities of carbon sequestration and all of the truck traffic and the pipeline activity that would be associated with that. We were able to prohibit that from state parks and include a 200-foot barrier to make sure that this couldn't happen within 200 feet of our state parks as well. So the original bill was very harmful, but we were able to successfully amend this bill by working with legislators. The next bill that we saw was Senate Bill 711. And this would have allowed ATVs on state parks. This is yet again a bill that we've seen multiple years in the making. And we really believe that our state parks, our state forests, our wildlife management areas, they are so sacred to us, and we have to keep them and protect them. And we saw, you know, when the difference of having a motorized trail versus a serene, peaceful, quiet outdoor space is very different, as you can imagine. And so we really tried to lean on a lot of language. You will see a lot of our graphics that I included in the slides tonight, because I wanted to show you all what messaging we use when we're trying to bring people along with us. And this is a really good example. And our public lands bills are some of the most popular for people to rally behind. People really care about their public lands. They want to see them protected. And I'm gonna give some numbers at the end, but we were able to rally, you know, nearly 1,000 people around this to make sure that our public lands stayed protected. And that's a really huge testament to the advocacy and the care that people have for their public lands. So one funny anecdote about this bill is that it actually got on the agenda on the same day as Environmental Day at the Capitol, which is when we bring a lot of folks to the Capitol to advocate and talk to their legislators and let them know how they feel about certain pieces of legislation. We think when they found out it was E-Day, they were like, there is no way we can have a room full of environmental activists here at our committee meeting. So it was removed from the agenda that day, and it never came up to see the light of day again. So we were chuckling at that one, because it was either a funny coincidence or good timing on our part. But either way, we were able to make sure that that bill was defeated. The next bill that we saw, this was a change. It was an extremely positive bill. This was one we were really excited about, and we were getting behind and really trying to push to the finish line. And this would have encouraged the creation of river access points whenever bridges are built or repaired. And so it really sparked a conversation about how in West Virginia we need to improve our public access to rivers and make sure, you know, in Shepherdstown we take for granted because we have our beautiful boat ramp where we're able to go down and walk to it, walk by the town run, and it meets the river, or we can go across the river to the C&O Canal. We have a lot of points of public access, but it's not that way in a lot of communities in West Virginia. So they have water, but they might not always be able to access it. And so this was a really important bill to be able to encourage that access to waterways, encouraging recreational opportunities. And we also really liked that it was responsible planning around wildlife management and around our river management. So it was a conversation that we wanted to see happen at the State House. Unfortunately, we did see it pass the Senate, but then it got stalled in the House. So this is a really good example of a place where we now know going into next year's session that this will be a multi-year attempt, and we will do some work in the off season to make sure that we can really build the coalition and build the support for this, to make sure that it can try to get over the finish line next year. There were some conversations about private property and making sure that this was implemented properly, so that might have been why it got stalled towards the end. We might have just not had the tools and resources in place to really make it happen yet. But it's something we really want to see happen, and so we'll continue to push for in the months ahead. The next bill that we have is around community air monitoring. I don't know if anyone has stuck with us and seen our action alerts over the last few years, but if so, you've probably had some deja vu on this one, because it is a bill that, once again, we've seen for multiple years in a row. Statewide, we have only about on average 10 air monitors that are permanent around the state. Some places say 9, some places say 13, some say 11, because they're testing for different air quality measurements. But we have something, you know, in that range. But unfortunately, whether it's 9, 11, or 13, either way, we have 55 counties in West Virginia. And some of these monitors are 2 to a county. And so what we see is a lot of counties left without data on their air quality. And so we've seen, you know, some temporary air monitors come into the scene. You've maybe heard of purple air monitors. Does anybody in here have a purple air monitor at their house? Oh, awesome. So these are air monitors that you are able to put up and get a live reading. And they contribute to a lot of collected data that are not used for regulatory purposes. This is really important, right? They are not used in court. But it's an opportunity for you to have information on what's happening on the ground, what's happening live, and to be able to aggregate that across regions. And what we saw, once again, was an attempt to limit that community air monitoring. And that really provides crucial local data to fill in those gaps when we don't have those permanent DEP monitors around the state. Thankfully, we were able to stall and defeat this bill towards the end. We weren't sure if it was gonna move. It was kind of one of those where we had heard it was, and then we heard it wasn't. So every week was a bit of a different story. But we were able to make sure to use, positive messaging around this and say, we support community science. How many folks in the room have ever participated in water monitoring? Anybody ever done that? Okay, so when you're going out to do that you're not an EPA certified lab. You don't become an expert when you go and test that water, but you gather some really important data, and then we can line it up against other data to understand what we're working with, right? We want communities to be able to do that. We want communities to be able to go out, gather data, and then of course, test it against other EPA certified data, or have DEP come in to look at the situation more closely. But we want folks to be able to have a starting point with that. And this was essentially trying to eliminate the use of their starting point. And we don't want to see that. We want to see community science supported. And so we were really excited that this was able to be defeated. The next bill, and if any questions come up around this, I'm gonna ask Dr. Hitt to speak to this, because he was a key player in this fight. He quoted that this was a bill, it's one of those in, what do they say, like a wolf in sheep's clothing or something like that. It had a really good title. It was called Sound Science and Regulations Act. When we hear that title, we like it. Right? We're like, yeah, we want sound science and we want that in our regulations. That makes sense. So Dan quoted, he said, while well titled, this was actually intended to censor science. And that was so mind blowing to me, because it had a great title, but what it really did was it took away our tools of science to protect public health. And it did so by preventing state agencies from using public health research. It created an impossible standard for that research to be able to be used. It prohibited state agencies from being able to use the best available science, because it banned research published in top-tier scientific journals. I mean, this is an area that I was learning so much about as it was happening. So I was like, what do you mean, Dan, that it was banning scientific journals? I mean, it was really at the core of it, it was scientific censorship, and it was going to impact nearly every aspect of state agency regulations. So thankfully we were able to have some conversations about this. I told people along the way, I said, it's an interesting day when we find ourselves on the same side as the Coal Association. And in that conversation we did, because the Coal Association agreed that it would really bar them from using science that was incredibly important to their work, and we felt similarly, and we said, okay, we both spoke in committee. We had a slightly different message with a different tone to it, but the principle of the matter was there, which is that we want to be able to use science for what it's intended for, and we don't want to be, censored on what is able to be passed. And one really incredible thing that Than did is he put together a scientist sign-on letter for this piece of legislation. So he had people in the scientific community who use scientific journals, who are the experts in this field, who write into scientific journals, and he was able to rally them and send a letter with dozens of scientists signed on to legislators, in addition to our community action alerts that we do for most bills that we have a stance on. He was able to really rally the science community around that, and I thought that was really, really incredible, which helped it eventually get defeated. It did see the light of day into committee, but then it was stopped in its tracks. And my final category that I have tonight is around data centers. Yeah, let's all take a deep breath. I heard one in the room. So House Bill 2014 was a piece of legislation that we saw come up this session, and unfortunately, I'll give away the spoiler alert, it did pass. It was titled the Certified Microgrid Program. And what it did was support high impact data centers coming to West Virginia. And we really had 4 main concerns with the bill. Well, we had a lot of concerns with the bill, but we categorized them into 4 areas. The first was that the data centers and associated microgrids that were proposed in this legislation have massive land use. So these facilities and grids have a maximum development of 2,250 acres, or more than 3.5 square miles. So if you can imagine the footprint on that, I mean, we don't see a footprint like that for almost anything, if you think about it. And so we really think that the massive impacts to just the land use alone, were enough to be concerned about. The second piece was around the lack of local control. So in this bill, it's stated, and I quote, that they are not subject to any county or municipal zoning, horticultural, noise, viewshed, lighting, development, or land use ordinances, restrictions, limitations, or approvals. And it essentially, I end my quote, it removed any local jurisdiction and gives residents very little say about how this will come to be in our communities. We don't have a say about locations, setbacks, the impacts of the facilities. And this is something we're already seeing communities raise the red flag about. In Tucker County, we are already seeing a proposal that is moving quickly. You know, folks who know more about data centers than I do will tell you that they do require a lot of infrastructure. They require a lot of infrastructure to be in place already, and Tucker County is one of those places where, you know, it's a prime place as far as the infrastructure and needs go. And so we're seeing it move very quickly, and we're also seeing hundreds of residents show up and say this is not acceptable. And so we're really trying to work with folks in Tucker County to figure out how they can leverage their voice, especially in light of this bill that literally removes the opportunity for local control, for local input. And we're really, that was one of our biggest concerns with this bill. The third area is around unlimited water use. We are seeing data centers, you know, it's a varying amount that they use. They are using less water now than they were originally. But we still see a ton of water loss. We see, you know, based on just the heat and the steam loss alone, we're seeing upwards of 1 million gallons of water a day that is being used or consumed. Now that fluctuates, so in some it may be less, but in some it may be more. And so we're really seeing this range, and we have a lack of information around if that water that will be used will be groundwater or if it will be surface water. There was no distinction made there. That's a very different situation, especially in a place like Jefferson County. And so we have some concerns there around the water usage. And lastly, around increased energy costs, because you know, the bill talked a lot about grid stabilization and grid security, but we know that this build out and maintenance of these data centers likely means higher electricity rates for us in West Virginia, where we already have some of the highest electricity rates in the country. And so we know that consumers are not going to be happy about that and have a lot of concerns there. And so we have yet to see how a lot of this will play out. So a lot of these concerns are really drawing from other areas that have already seen data center development, like our neighbor Loudoun County, where, you know, we've seen them make decisions and then we've seen them walk back some of those decisions and say, oh, we really should have put water use restrictions or land use restrictions in place. And so we really want to see West Virginia take a proactive stance here. But unfortunately, this bill kind of, I said it kind of delivered the gift of data centers already wrapped up with a bow on them, and we are left to pick up the pieces and to figure out what that looks like. And I do encourage folks to look into the Independent Observer, a great newspaper here in the Shepherdstown, Jefferson County area. They've been doing a lot of really good reporting and digging up the facts. Steve and Harriet Pearson do a great job. They have been reporting a lot on a potential data center development in Berkeley, Jefferson County, right over near Hospice of the Eastern Panhandle. If folks have ever attended some of the monthly programs over there, we're seeing a potential development over there. And so that is looking like a data center. And so Steve has been doing a lot of awesome reporting on that. I highly encourage you to go to him because, or his written pieces, because he does a lot of digging up on this specific piece that is so needed at this time. So in conclusion, we saw this session a lot of industry-backed bills. We see that every year, but I think this year had a particular flavor to it where, as I stated previously, we saw multi-year attempts that were really, really, furthered and pushed over the finish line this year, and some of them had a lot of concerns, the category A being, category A changes being one of the main pieces of concern for us at West Virginia Rivers. We also saw a lot of topics that were not addressed, that we know are chronic issues in West Virginia. That ranges from flood relief. I mean, session started February 12th this year. We then proceeded to see catastrophic flooding in southern West Virginia on February 14th. And so it was 2 days into the 60-day session, and then we saw nothing really done about flood relief for the remaining 58 days. And so we really were disappointed in our legislators. We did see some attempts, and I will give credit to folks who voted yes on those attempts for flood relief and flood resiliency funding. But unfortunately, we didn't see anything cross the finish line, even as communities in southern West Virginia are still currently struggling with that devastating issue. The second is really around chronic water quality concerns. So these are issues that we know are present across our state. We see some of the highest amount of violations in West Virginia that compared to any other state. And so we know this is an issue, and unfortunately we saw a lack of initiative or leadership or creativity around this specific topic that we know needs addressed. However, I will end on a positive note, because while we didn't see all the progress that we hoped for, we did see people show up. And sorry, when I talk a lot, we saw people show up and really show their support to make a real difference. We had over 8,000 people who took action on action alerts across all of these topics that I've covered tonight, and who sent over 100,000 messages to legislators. That is amazing. We have legislators throughout the session who come up to us and say, I received so many emails about this topic, can you tell me more about it? And so it might not always be the end all be all, but it is a starting point. It's a place to start using your voice, to start engaging in the conversation. And we really do believe that every email, phone call makes a difference, because those bills that we saw that were taken off of the agenda or that were stalled at the last minute, public participation has a role to play there. And so we really thank everybody for showing up with us, for answering those continuous action alerts all throughout session, and for really working to protect water quality and public health along with us. So overall, this session really reminded us of the power of our steady collaboration and advocacy in the movement, and how necessary that is to keep up the fight. So I'm happy to take any questions, and I thank you all for listening. I know that was a lot of information in a short amount of time, and I probably could have covered at least 10 other bills that had relevancy to us, but I tried to pick some really important ones kind of across the gamut, but happy to take any questions from folks. Yes, Sue, and I'm gonna grab water.
Okay, yes.
But you can ask.
So this was a wonderful summary. You know, I'm a sports person, so it feels to me like it's defense. Let's flip it and talk about offense. You know, if you could tell me 3 bills that you would like to draft and present and get through the legislature next session.
That is a great question. So the question was from a sports fan in the room who said that this feels like a lot of defense. And I will say, over the last few years working at the legislature, it is a lot of defense. It absolutely is. One thing that I will state that I think was a really proud offensive moment that I gave my last presentation with at PBAS that I think is really important to note here is the passage of the PFAS Protection Act in 2023. So that piece of legislation essentially put DEP in motion to be able to start to address PFAS contamination at the source. We know this is a massive issue, and that bill was not the end all be all, but it was a start. Unfortunately, what we've seen is a lack of funding that goes to that, and that's what we see in West Virginia a lot, is we see good bills pass that are unfunded mandates. We see no resources going to these very critical issues. PFAS is a great example in that, so I would say probably my first one would be more around PFAS contamination, but of course I follow that up very quickly to say, and we have to give the resources to that. Same with flood resiliency. So we actually have seen a flood resiliency trust fund that was established and never had a single dollar put into it. So it's kind of situations like that where we see these priorities recognized, and they are very important, but we're not seeing a lot of resources go to them, and that is a chronic issue. And then the third that I would say is around water quality, and I would probably actually bump that to my first priority if I could, because we have people in West Virginia right now who do not have access to clean and safe drinking water. We know this, but we can't know it and not do anything about it for very much longer. I mean, people are really, really struggling. We went down as a team as West Virginia Rivers and down to the Dan, what am I thinking?
Wyoming County.
Wyoming County, I was like, yes, Indian Creek, yeah, I was like, is that it? You start saying all these words and all the other words leave your brain. But Indian Creek in Wyoming County, we had a tour of some residents down there, and they are some incredible people who are doing some amazing water protecting, but they can only do so much when they have, harmful, poisonous water spewing out from the ground. It's like, where do we go from here? And so I think my broad answer to the question, Sue, and it's a great question, because I would do a lot of things if I could under that gold dome, but I think the important thing to note is that we really need to pay attention to what our priorities are, and we really need to make sure that those priorities are getting acted on. Yeah, Dan.
Let me add one more to the list. We have a campaign to expand cold water conservation in the state of West Virginia to double the amount of recognized trout water. And that's so important. Brook trout is our state fish, right? We love this. And what we've learned through partners and collecting data with West Virginia DNR is that there are many streams out there that have brook trout, but that are not recognized as such by the state DEP, so the water quality standards don't follow. We're gonna lean into this, and that's a legislative action that we could expect to see in the next cycle or two that we would want to support. And we'll have the backing of anglers and locals, as well as the data are on our side.
Yes, and I'm just gonna repeat that for our folks on Zoom, that Dan added that a piece of legislative a proposal that we would add to the mix is expanding cold water conservation, especially for brook trout that are not recognized as brook trout waters. And this is a huge opportunity for legislative action. We have the support of anglers, local communities. And I will use this opportunity to say this is exactly why Dan is our technical expert, because it's my job to go in and talk to people, but it's often his job to brief me on what I'm talking about. And so this is a prime example of, it's all of us working together. We have a lot of skills across the team at West Virginia Rivers, and I am not a scientist, so I have to figure out how to talk about the science, but I think that's an important thing to note, because a lot of our legislators also are not scientists. They are not doctors. They're not public health officials. And so we have to be able to bring the information down to a level where we can all understand it so that we can make some progress around it. So thank you, Dan, for your continued work. And I agree, that's a huge priority. Other questions? Yeah.
Could you walk us through how your organization goes through a bill, like the campaign it takes and who you talk to and how you advocate for it?
Oh, yeah, that's a great question. So it's, the question was, how does our organization go through a bill? How we talk about it, how we advocate around it. And I would say, to start to answer the question, I would say it depends on the bill. Depends on if we're playing defense or offense. In 2023, when we were working to pass the PFAS Protection Act, I can tell you that the work started long before the legislative session actually began. Because we needed to start bringing stakeholders into the room, we needed to gather the partners around us to make sure that we could prove the importance of this bill before day one of session. So the most successful bills that you'll see in the legislature have already had that legwork done previous to stepping into session for the first day. So I think that's really important to note. But if it's a bill, I'll tell a little bit though about my job during session. One of my main roles is to track bills. So every morning, and really a lot of times it's the night before, bills that are to be introduced, they get posted on the legislative website, which if anyone has ever tried to navigate the legislative website, it is impossible. It is so difficult. If you don't know what you're doing, you would have no idea where to find any of the things. So I think that's a real room for improvement. But if you can find it, once you do, you're able to go on and see the bills that will be introduced, and you're able to see what committees it's going to be referenced to. You're able to look at the bill text, you're able to see if any amendments have been proposed on it already. And so a big piece of our work is going through all of those bills every single day. But especially at the beginning of session, there might be a couple hundred bills that are introduced between the House and the Senate on a single day. So we're doing a lot of, and you can't just go off of the titles, because sometimes the titles make you think it's about one thing, and then you read the bill and you're like, that has nothing to do with that said title. And so it's a lot of, I would say, like, using a fine tooth comb to try to like piece through, what the legislation that is introduced, might entail. The next thing that I would say happens, and this is probably the hardest part, is trying to figure out what the bill actually intends to do. So you're reading the bill and you're like, this has a lot of words, but what is it actually doing? So then you talk with one another and you're like, well, Stan and I sent a lot of emails back and we're like, well, the way I understand this bill is blah, 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 because in fact, you don't know if that's totally right. So it's a lot of kind of scoping out the bill, I would say, especially early on. Then you try to start to put your ear to the ground. And this is where lobbying, I think, comes in as a really important tactic. You've got to have people at the Capitol who are like marching the march every day. They're like on those marble floors, walking the halls back and forth, trying to figure out like who is behind this bill, who is pushing for it, who's against it. That's a really important thing to know. We've seen a lot of times at the legislature, for example, that if the oil and gas industry is for a bill and the coal association is against a bill, that's a really interesting conversation to watch play out, because they're two very powerful forces, and if they go head to head, sometimes we can watch a bill do a lot of things without us intervening much or kind of watching that play out. Or we can then send 700 emails in the background through our, have our supporters send out a bill, an action alert to say we don't support the bill, and we're able to kind of push on those weak places wherever they may be. So I would say a lot of the beginning of session especially is like navigating through, what does the bill say? Where does everybody stand? We also try to spread a lot of fact-based information, so we try to gather as much data as possible. We put it in one-pagers a lot of times. This year they were more like 4-pagers because there was a lot of information moving, but on the tank bill that I talked to you all about early on, we put together a fact sheet pretty early on because we knew it was gonna be a really big bill and we really did not wanna see it pass. So we were able to take a lot of information, put it into sort of a graphic handout that we were able to use talking to legislators, and then we try to get meetings with them. We try to find them in their committee meetings if we can't get a meeting with them. So I would say it's a combination of a lot of pieces, and the awesome opportunity there is that you have hopefully a lot of awesome folks on your team who can take on different roles. So you may have one person who's way better at reading the bills and, doing that analysis. You may have somebody else who's a lot better at talking to DEP to figure out where they might stand. So it's a lot of different skills that I would say we layer together depending on what the bill is and how it's moving. But I'd be happy to talk to you more about sort of the process. I will also say I've learned a lot of this in the last like 2 to 3 years. I did a lot of work like more on municipal levels before, and then one year got the opportunity to go down and lobby at the Capitol and learned so much about the process. So I highly encourage anybody who's interested to get involved, like go down for a day. If come with us to Environmental Day, or, you know, try to get an opportunity to just go down and see how it operates. Cause I think part of the challenge is that we are on the outside of that gold dome a lot, and there's a lot happening inside. You almost have to step in to find out a little bit more about what's really going on under that roof. Hope that answered your question. That's all to say, we do a lot of things. Yes.
Yeah, I had a question about the data centers. You said that the local people have no real say in any decision involved with that. How they take up such huge tracts of land? What is the process of who is buying that land? What is the process? Is it a public process that you can get involved in that point to try to fight it, or is it all done behind closed doors?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the question was, if there's no local input early on in the process, sort of how does that all happen? And what's the point of intervention? Is that?
Yeah, well, and the land is I mean, you said that there was so much land involved. It takes up so much land that's a big purchase.
Mhm.
How does that come about?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Is there any-
So we did see written into the bill that, a new committee will be formed to take this on, and so it's like a task force, that will be addressing a lot of the, future, implementation of this legislation. Unfortunately, many of those seats, if not all of them, will likely be governor appointed. And so, you know, we have limited, maybe opportunity there, but I do think there will be, points in the process for us to engage. We just don't quite know what they are yet because we haven't seen it roll out fully. We do have small data centers in West Virginia, a few of them, a handful of them, but we really haven't seen this massive development on this scale. And so I think as we see it become more popular in West Virginia, we'll get a better sense of how it's going to play out. But I don't know if any other folks have additional information on that.
I was just trying to figure out which, I mean, we have like, would it fall under environmental protection? Is that gonna be the overall writing the regulations related to this bill, or which group of government areas would be involved in writing the regulations related to it, or we don't know at this point?
That's a fantastic question that I will look into and get back to you, because I don't think I have that answer right now. It maybe has not been spelled out fully yet, but I need to look into it to make sure I'm giving the right information. And I saw some information maybe here. Is that, or a question?
Well, I just had a question
Yeah.
about the data center. Why is West Virginia so interested in these data centers, the development of them so quickly, and will they provide a lot of jobs? It sounds like they're gonna use a lot of water. Why do they use so much water? You said like 1 million gallons a day?
Yeah, so that's a lot of great questions, and I wish I was a data center expert, because in the last few weeks, it would be really helpful. What I know about why West Virginia, is that we are a neighbor to where a lot of this development has already been taking place. So Northern Virginia to us is a hop, skip, and a jump away, and we've seen quite a bit of data center development take place in Loudoun County specifically, across Northern Virginia, across Virginia as a whole. And so I think as the next closest neighbor with a lot of land, we're seeing it sort of an opportunity space. And, you know, I have heard the argument from folks, and it is true, there is a lot of tax revenue available from this development, and that is something that West Virginia at times really lacks in. And so we've seen a lot of, you know, positive argument on behalf of these data centers. Also, when I talk to high school students, I like to say, how many of you all like to use ChatGPT? And all of their hands go up. So it's like, we can talk about the environmental impacts of this, but we also have to talk about the necessity of development here, and that our world is sort of just moving in this direction. So we're not blind to any of that, and I like to name that, because we're not sitting here saying that, trying to stop a huge, train in its tracks. It's already rolling on without us, but what we're trying to say is that if this development is going to happen, can it take place as responsibly as possible? And that's really the stance we're trying to take and that's why, the local control, the water use regulations would be an opportunity for, the footprint of development to maybe be a little lighter. But we unfortunately are not really seeing that honored. So I hope that answers your question, but I think data centers, it's a really pretty new field that's expanding pretty rapidly. Over the last 10 years, we've seen it grow enormously, and so we don't really know what the next 5 or 10 years holds.
And I understand one of these is gonna be around Davis and Thomas, and, that seems pretty far out from Loudoun County to me, but, I'm wondering why they picked that area, and I just talked to a friend that lives and works there, and he's really concerned about it, the light pollution and the.
Yeah, I was asked about the Thomas Davis development specifically, and that's what I was referring to when I said Tucker County, where we've seen a lot of folks show up against this. I heard there specifically that, part of the infrastructure that's needed is fiber optic. Anybody know more about that? Any technical experts in the room? Yeah.
What, it's.
You're like me,
Well, it's
yeah, take
just
it
like-
away.
it's just Very, very high speed internet.
High-speed internet,
It's
fiber
like-
optic necessity, and apparently, I guess Tucker County, the Thomas Davis area has some of that infrastructure already built in from prior development, from what I've heard. So there's pieces like that where folks might have pieces of the puzzle, and it creates the perfect storm. I don't know enough about it, but that's what I understand.
Oh, I'm sorry, but just one more thing. The fellow was saying he thought it'd be nice if they moved it closer, when you mentioned Mountain Storm, if they moved it closer to Mountain Storm instead of closer to the towns of Davis and Thomas.
Yeah.
Is one concern that they would.
Right, and we know Thomas and Davis, if you've been there, they're like the most beloved communities filled with artists and beautiful water running through and these like little cafes, that are just like, it's literally, I think, one of the coziest places on earth. And to pair that with this like massive development, it just doesn't fit, right? And so, I second that. I wanna see those places protected that really are the core of our communities in West Virginia. We have yet to see how it will play out. Corridor H, we are still fighting that bear of a situation in a lot of ways. The highway development, it has also proposed to go right through, Thomas and Davis area, especially this new segment that's next up for development. And so we see a lot of threats come to that, but that's an area where we've at least been able to be successful in some conversations to say, maybe we can reduce the impact here. And that would be a better case scenario. And so hopefully we can use that as a model to maybe reduce impact here. That's really what we're arguing for, because we don't know that we'll be able to say no more data centers ever again. That might not be realistic here, right? But can we reduce impact on this development? Okay, I saw your hands.
Yeah, I just am following the development of that bill some and writing comments here and there. At the first, the state was claiming all the tax revenue.
Yes.
The real estate tax revenue was gonna all come to the state. The locality got whatever the land was taxed at when it was ag, that couple thousand. The county could keep that, but all of the, increase of a couple of million in real estate tax from such a center was all going to the state. And whatever the battles were during the legislature, it ended up that 30% now of that real estate revenue, added revenue, goes to the locality. But,
Yes.
but still the governor's, insistence that the state would control all of these and the local jurisdiction is diddly squat, they might as well not be there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's just totally offensive, I would think,
Right.
and a lot of people try to fight it tooth and nail.
It's true. I'm gonna repeat a little bit of that just so that folks on Zoom can hear adequately. But Kay brought up about the state tax revenue and that when the original bill came out, that all of the tax revenue was going to the state. So it was going to be centralized at the state. Fortunately, we did have a lot of folks come and share public comment, including our Jefferson County commissioners and Berkeley County commissioners of our, of our region. And they came and spoke at the committee meeting down in Charleston, and one win that they were able to secure is that 30% of the added revenue will go to the locality. So I did have that in my notes, but I forgot to mention that earlier. So the tax revenue has shifted a little bit to be slightly more equitable, which is an important thing, but in the grand scheme of things, it was like crumbs, because to your point, there's still gonna be a lot of state control here. And, there's still a lot of local impact that I think is not quite accounted for.
And I don't think it's needed because this data center is coming into Berkeley County, right?
Mhm.
On the
Yes.
line near hospice,
Yes,
and they were already negotiating that, so why does the state have to come in and
right,
try
right.
to claim
It's very
control?
complex. And as we know, in the Eastern Panhandle, we've always had a bit of interesting relationship to the state. We're quite far from our state capital, right? Which is why I think meetings like this are really important to talk about what happens there. We have, I think it's 4 other state capitals that are actually closer to us, than Charleston is. And so it's really important for us to be in conversation about what's happening there, because it can feel like worlds away. But it really does come to impact a lot of what we do here in the Panhandle. Laurel.
I have a few questions from Zoom, but we
Okay.
can kind of bounce back and forth
Great.
Zoom in the room. So I'll start with one. Eileen asks, how can a person who's not a resident of West Virginia, like not a constituent of any West Virginia legislator, effectively make a comment on West Virginia environmental issues? They don't seem interested because I won't be voting for or against them.
That's a really good question, and we do get that question a lot from legislators, about how many people, sorry, I'll repeat the question. The question was, how can a person who is not a resident of West Virginia, engage thoughtfully around environmental protection in West Virginia? Especially given that when they do email folks, they don't quite care because they're not a constituent. Yeah, okay, so, that's a great question, and one thing that we do when we, gather action alert responses is that we do ask for people's zip code. You don't have to give us your whole address, but we do ask for zips. That way we can target your legislators when you're writing to them. And it does make it difficult at times, for out of state folks. And some of our action alerts are not tied to zip codes. So we kind of try to base it off of whether or not this really has like a local, effect. Our communications team does a lot of figuring out if this is a zip code targeted action alert. I do still think there's a role to play for anyone to write to legislators, and what I would say also is that hopefully that person has an avenue to write to the legislators in their state as well. Because I do think it's more effective when you say, hey, I live in your district, you represent me, and here are my needs. I think that is definitely the most effective message, that when talking to legislators, they always want to know how many folks are quote unquote actually from West Virginia. And that's what they say, because they kind of, sometimes they doubt that our numbers are real. They think we make people up and then give them email addresses and to write to them. And I'm like, no, these are real people. So a lot of times we have to deliver, names and zip codes, to really show the validity in our comments. But that's all to say, I think there's different ways of engaging, and I do still think it's important. Maybe there's an opportunity there, to write to some of the congressional leaders too, because they tend to cover larger parts of the state. So I think there's a few different avenues, writing to your own state legislators, writing to folks when we don't have zip codes tied to our action alerts. Just keep using your voice in whatever form that comes in, because it might not be effective for one legislator, but it might be for the next. Yeah.
To kind of address his question about the water, right?
Mhm.
Because I'm living on Earth on Sunday. But the reason they use so much water is to cool the equipment down. And one of the issues that they brought up was that, like when you take a bath or run your dishwasher or whatever, you use a certain amount of water, and then that water goes back into the system and it gets processed and cleaned up and will be reused again. Whereas when they're using water, it evaporates. So that water is
It would
gone.
probably be for cooling, but why don't they do geothermal? Why don't they have a closed system instead of getting rid of so much water?
Yeah,
I don't know.
They
And
haven't been
I have
asked to
seen it
or
in-
forced.
Yeah, so the comment was that, the reason they use so much water is to cool the equipment down. And the argument here is when you take a bath or you run your dishwasher, you use a certain amount, but then the wastewater or the excess water is going back into the system, right? Ideally going back into the groundwater, recharging it, and the question was, why don't they use a closed system with geothermal energy? And I think, like I stated, I think some of those technologies are starting to be looked at. I have heard that they are getting more efficient over time. So I think that's important to note here because they are advancing, but I don't know that they're advancing quickly enough for how fast we're demanding the use and how quickly we are building them.
And the point that I
Mhm.
actually wanted to make before that was, yeah, I'm an audiologist and my concern is often noise. And one of the things that I've seen a lot about is the amount of noise that these things generate.
Yeah.
And I haven't heard that mentioned.
Yes, and that was stated in the bill, that noise complaints could not be a cause for any local control. So the last point that was made is around, noise concerns. And we have seen that, we've seen some places where they've started to build buffers to address the noise concerns, but if they don't have to, will they? That's the question. And so, again, a lot is yet to be seen. We may see a period of trial and error with some of this in West Virginia, which, like I said, we would love to see it be a little more proactive, a lot more proactive. But we will continue to try to address it as it gets implemented. Yeah.
How many bills did you see related to the environment that looked like it was a copy paste from another state?
Oh, great question. The question was how many bills related to the environment looked like they were copy and paste from directly from other states? And the answer is a lot. I don't have an exact number because I am not, obviously looking at legislation from other states. I'm focused on West Virginia, but the Sound Science and Regulations Bill, or really what we call the anti-science bill, is a prime example of where that happened this year. We saw the exact same bill come up in the state of Tennessee. And in Tennessee, that bill, it was amended, but it did pass. And so that was happening just ahead of our process. So we were kind of watching it pass in Tennessee. And really hoping that that was not writing on the wall for us. Thankfully, we were able to stop it, but this is something we see quite often. It was also interesting because I was in a lot of meetings with Dan. We were marching those halls together on this bill specifically because it came up around our environmental day, which I mentioned previously. And when we talked to legislators about it, they said, oh, I wrote that bill. And we were so confused because we're like, okay, then you either wrote it and gave it to Tennessee or you didn't write it, but you want it to look like you wrote it. So it was a little confusing. And that is one thing. We see a lot of national interest groups at play that come in and propose legislation and say, hey, take this and run with it. You can make it your own. But we really want to see this pass. And so I would say we rely a lot on our national organizations at that time too. To help flag things for us because we were actually able to connect with folks at the Environmental Working Group who were able to help us identify some of the places of intervention in Tennessee that we were able to copy and paste similarly as points of intervention in West Virginia. So that's a long-winded way of saying there are a lot of bills that get copy and pasted across states, and that is part of our job to figure out how are other states combating those. And yeah,
Let me chime in there real quick.
Yeah.
So the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, watch for that. It's almost always bad. And then the US Chamber of Commerce. So in this case, the US Chamber of Commerce came to Tennessee and West Virginia with their lobbyists and their petrochemical industry money. And they thought they were gonna push us around because they thought that we didn't know what real science was. And we didn't know the difference between a scientific journal and a blog post. And I mean, that's insulting.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's an accident. Look at this. Why did they go to Republican supermajority states to push this through? They wanted to see how far they could get. They were treating us as a national laboratory for legislative malpractice. Okay? So we have a win here in West Virginia. We should really be proud of it. This is a good thing. because we said, no, we know the difference, we're not gonna accept this. Tennessee didn't get there, but they did amend that bill in a positive way to strip out the most draconian anti-science, but the most draconian science censorship provisions, but still, that's important. So for me, it was very informative because it was the US Chamber of Commerce and their petrochemically infused, funding. They're the largest lobbying firm in the nation, okay? So, follow the money. And in West Virginia, of course, there are a lot of people that are employed by the petrochemical industries, particularly in the Ohio River Valley, who respect that. But there are also a lot of people that are being poisoned by the same industry across the state and respect that too.
Yeah, so just to recap that a little bit, and I won't be able to do it eloquently, but, a couple places that we've definitely seen this copy and pasting of legislation is the American Legislative Exchange Council, also known as ALEC, the US Chamber of Commerce. That was particularly the big push behind the Sound Science and Regulations bill. They had a lot of petrochem lobbyists who are really pushing for this. And they go to states with Republican supermajorities and kind of treat us as a laboratory for legislative malpractice, which is a fantastic quote from my colleague Dan. And that is true. I mean, we've seen this year after year, and we've even heard on the, in the halls of the Capitol, people say, oh, we're testing this here in West Virginia. And if it passes here, we're gonna take it to 5 other states. And so when we're able to stop those really harmful tests, that legislative malpractice laboratory, then that's a really huge win, because it might also mean protecting a lot of other people down the line from that same potentially very harmful bill. Yes, Laurel.
Yeah, so I have a question from Greg on Zoom. He said, are there positive prospects for restoring federal funding to support the state PFAS efforts?
Oh, great question. So Greg asked if there are positive prospects for restoring the federal funding around PFAS efforts. This is something that I've worked a lot on the last couple of years to try to push our state to implement that PFAS Protection Act that I spoke about earlier. We had a federal funding grant that we were partners with PVAS along with many other orgs, 20 other organizations. It was a grant from EPA and it was terminated just a few weeks ago. So I think that's what Greg is referring to. And his question is, are there prospects for that to be restored? My response is, I really hope so. And as I stated previously, this is a critical area that needs addressed. And it has to be addressed. We cannot just keep going on without, and looking the other way. So the state took the first step in passing the bill, and I really hope that they continue to take additional steps. Whether that funding from the federal level comes back or not, I hope that we see funding and resources go to this in general, whether that's from, restored funding from the federal side. I will say we did see Senator Shelley Moore Capito speak on our behalf about this bill. She is pushing for this funding to be restored because this has been a really big priority for her over the last few years. She cares a lot about public health, and has pushed for a lot of PFAS infrastructure. So I'm hoping that having, someone that high up advocating for us to have those resources will help. But it, again, has yet to be seen on how that's gonna shake out. Yes, Sue.
So I've had very positive and helpful interactions with the state officials who work at DEP and at the Public Service Commission. What has happened to their budgets? And are any of those departments under threat to be cut back?
Yes, so the question is, well, the statement and then question was that, this person, Sue, has had very positive and helpful interactions with state officials who work at DEP and the public service districts, and what is the status of their funding, and have they been cut back? That is a fantastic question. I will be honest, the budget is not an area that I followed as closely this legislative session because it passed really close to the end of session when a lot of our very powerful bills were, some really bad bills were all moving at once. And so I was very, tuned in there. So this is another space that I'll have to look into to get a little bit, additional information for you and follow up on that. One thing I will say is that, we're definitely seeing some, I know DEP, for example, benefited from AmeriCorps' positions over the last few years, and so we're already seeing some of their positions and support be reduced, and so that's definitely one place that I would say, yes, they are being impacted, and I anticipate that we may see more impacts. I can get back to you with additional details on that. Yes, Laura.
I have another question from Greg. He asked, is Sidewinder a significant player in West Virginia legislation?
Oh, that is a great question. Something that I managed to avoid until this point in the conversation. The question was, is Sidewinder a big player at the West Virginia Capitol? And my answer is they were not previously, but they absolutely were this year. So for folks who don't know, maybe everyone in this room knows, Sidewinder is the company that is proposing the Mountain Pure water bottling facility out in Middleway. There's been quite a bit of conversation about this over the last few months. There was a planning commission meeting back in March where it was unanimously rejected their concept plan to move forward with this, but the conversation continues, and I will put it that way. I will say they did have a very strong presence at the Capitol this year. We saw at least 3 to 4 to 5 lobbyists who, in West Virginia, you have to state who you are lobbying on behalf of. So there's a lobbyist directory, which is a really helpful tool if you're spending time in the Capitol, because you can go and look at who folks are representing. And some people are representing about 20 groups, so you may not actually know who they're in a meeting with on any given day or for what topic. But it's helpful to be able to reference, and I will say Sidewinder showed up quite a few times in that lobbyist directory this year, and that is something we hadn't seen previously. So we have definitely seen them have a presence at the Capitol. There were a few bills that I actually did not get into this evening around groundwater protection that I'll just go ahead and mention. Delegate Funkhauser introduced, House Bill 3025 and 3026, which were both attempts to protect groundwater through various methods. We also had House Bill 3174, which was actually a different bill. It was requiring municipalities to do certain things for waste and sewer service, but when it went over to the Senate side, after it had already passed the first chamber, when it went over, Senators Rucker and Barrett from our region actually tried to amend the bill to have it include protections around groundwater usage, specifically for water bottling. So we did see some attempts for groundwater protection as far as water bottling goes. Unfortunately, none of those got across the finish line. The one amendment from Barrett failed on the Senate floor by, I think, 2 votes, 2 or 3, so it was very, very close. But I will say it was definitely a conversation at the Capitol this year that we saw come up. And it's one we anticipate continuing to come up, especially given that even though the Planning Commission rejected the concept plan, this is a continued conversation about Sidewinder's presence and what that space may become. And at West Virginia Rivers, we just really believe in protecting groundwater resources for all of us. We think that's very, very important, so we'll continue to watch for that in the sessions ahead. Any final questions? Any others on Zoom?
No more on Zoom.
All right, awesome. Well, I want to thank you all. I know I covered a lot of information in a short amount of time. So if you have specific questions for me or Than or for our team at any given time, our email addresses are on our website, which is wvrivers.org. You can reach out to us at any time. If we don't have the answer, we'll at least try to find it for you. But I really appreciate you all spending your evening here in conversation about this. This is incredibly important, and your participation means a lot, and here's to continue to protect our water across West Virginia. Thank you.
Here.
I know, hands in.